Welcome everyone to our regular Canadian Association for Club of Rome Wednesday presentation series. Today we have Vic Buxton, who's a KCOR member, who is very qualified and can make his presentation, which we've entitled Environment, Ethics, and Sustainable Development. I expect this will run for about 40 minutes, and then we will have a question period after. Vic, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and the background?
Yes, my educational background is chemistry from Ryerson, chemical engineering from Michigan Technological University, and a master's degree in civil engineering from Waterloo, University of Waterloo. The reason is I was interested in environment, and back in those days, there was no postgraduate programs available in environment. So basically, I had to get, some of the hydraulics and all of that, because in the 50s and early 60s, the concern was that pollution threats were all water related. So basically, what I want to do today, if I can, is I want to really walk you along the path, which is the road to Rio. And I'll go through the slides, but what this is a collection of notes and information that I kept a record of during that really interesting time. And I think you'll share with me in a minute and you'll see what I'm up to. So shall I go ahead, Art?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, geez. It's not changing. Sorry, Art, I just developed a problem. I can't understand why it's not. There we go. Okay, it's now working. All right. So everyone heard from Paul about the UN Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm, Sweden. Okay, in '72. The catalyst for that was the scientists all over the world were saying that the global environment was in serious trouble, needed a political focus, both domestically and internationally. And that was what emerged during that preparatory 2-year phase in advance of Stockholm. Canada decided they were going to respond. They created the Department of the Environment in 1971. The US created EPA in a number of Nordic states and created a focal point to deal with environmental issues as well. The next step forward was Gro Brundtland, who was the Norwegian Prime Minister, initiated the call to arms with Our Common Future, the report of the Royal Commission on Environment and Development. And this report called for the global integration of economic environment considerations. And basically that was the initiator for the UNCED preparation phase. UNCED stands for United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as UNCED Summit. But it was expected to reach global agreement on a plan to create sustainable livelihoods and sustainable futures for all the people on the planet. UNCED content was developed over 2 years, led by a Canadian, just like the Stockholm Conference, Maurice Strong, and was designed to be a process review of ongoing processes. Or for another viewpoint, it was supposed to be a strategic plan for learning how to live off the planet's ecological interests. The UNCED actual Earth Summit was held in the presence of heads of government between April 3 and 14 in June 1992. And that became the code for the emerging debate regarding the survival of the planet. Okay, and what emerged from UNCED was Agenda 21, that's the agenda for the 21st century, the Rio Declaration, and then there were a whole bunch of treaties that were signed there, and final composite negotiating text was agreed to, but signed off at UNCED. And the reason for that was all of these 108 heads of government were in attendance. Okay, what UNCED brought together for the first time was leaders of the world to discuss the world's ecological future. There were fundamentally 3 camps participating in the participatory debates. There were deep ecologists, ethicists, and economists, and that's why it gives rise to the title of this presentation. The intellectual debate centered around the proper role and structure of economic activity. The economic argument was poverty is at the root of environmental destruction and increased wealth is needed to combat poverty. The debate centered on the point that the discipline of economics is predicated on growth. But what was observed is we need finite economics for a finite planet. And then some other observations pertaining to the roles in these discussions and debate on economics were, there can be no economy in the absence of a viable ecosystem. Nobody can argue that point. Economic activity must be ethically driven and structured to protect the essential life support systems of the planet. There can be no successful human economy platform from nature or in defiance of nature. And then somebody during the debates raised a quote from Wendell Berry. We all live by robbing nature, and our standard of living demands that the robbery continues. Environment destruction occurs when people have too little or too much. Okay, some key observations along that road was global warming and stratospheric ozone depletion is a form of feedback from the Earth's ecological system to the world's economic system. And that was from a colleague that many of you might know, Jim McNeil. Some ethicists asked during the debate, is the hole in the ozone layer another example of nature's veto? An ethically based mega root question was and still is, how much is enough? If wants remain insatiable, can there ever be such a thing as enough? And then somebody raised the point that a child asked him, does the hole in the stratosphere now mean we're polluting the universe? Now, coming to ethics, I did some research on this back in the early mid-90s, late 90s, I guess. The Oxford Dictionary is pretty succinct in it. It said it's a set of moral principles, the science of morals and human conduct, and the rules of conduct. But dictionary.com had a more expansive. They said it's a system of moral principles, the ethics of a culture. They said rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group. For example, medical ethics, Christian ethics, etc. And the other one, moral principles as of an individual. Example, his ethics forbade betrayal of confidence. And another point was ethics is that branch of philosophy dealing with the values relating to human conduct with respect to the righteousness and lawfulness of certain actions and to the goodness and badness of motives and end of such actions. So you can see how complicated the concept of ethics is. Now, I attended a presentation by the Canadian Chemical Producers Association back in 1995. And recall that there had been a lot of focus on the environment and industry's role. And this was, I think, if I remember correctly, just after Bhopal. It was 94 or something that killed 4,000 people. That's Union Carbide's accident at one of their chemical producing plants. Okay? And an interesting thing is they quoted this and they got agreement between all the members of the Canadian Chemical Producers Association. And the old ethic, do the minimum the law requires, their example of setting a new ethic was exceed the letter and spirit of the law. The old ethic, keep a low profile. The new ethic, be seen to be doing the right thing. Limited product related obligation, the old ethics, exercise life cycle stewardship. And we could talk about cradle to grave and all the other things with separate issue. Okay, the assumption of product process innocence was the old ethic. The new ethic was risk-based precautionary approach. The old ethic, supply hazard info when required by law. The new ethic, public and employees' right to know all risks. This is, and I'll just pause there for a minute, but I was over with the Royal Bank and the reconstruction after the fall of Russia. And I was assigned to go looking at waste disposal sites. One of my colleagues, who was an advisor to Boris Yeltsin, told me, Vic, don't come over and do that job without a simulation counter on your chest. I said, why? He said, because we had an example in Moscow of one of these waste sites. Somebody had dumped radioactive waste, and the guy that was supposed to be plowing it over to cover it up ended up dying from radiation. So that's exactly what I did. I wore simulation counters the whole time I was in Russia. Anyway, the next ethic was defensive approach to new regulations. The new ethic, lead in public policy process. And then old ethic, every company for themselves. The new ethic, mutual aid and peer pressure. The old ethic, ignore or fight advocates. The new ethic, seek advocate input. The bottom line and laws guide decisions. And the new ethic, integrate all into decision. Now, this is what they said in their their publication and said all of their members endorsed. But my own personal experience after that time was that wasn't exactly the case in many cases. Now, this graph, and you wonder why I put this up, but this is something that's been very, very important to me over the years, okay? What the diagram here says is it's looking at air, water, waste, land, and socioeconomic considerations. And the first layer outlines the symptoms or evidence for each one of those. The next level looks at it as it's the surface cause, okay? And it's like fossil fuel being the surface cause for emissions, okay? Then the continuing underlying issues or causes. Then it outlines the root cause, and it eventually comes down to misguided values and beliefs that underpin everything. Even this, you look on the very far side, you'll see up in the top right-hand corner, poverty, alienation, unemployment, and it comes right down. You can see where it factors in, and then look at the root causes going across there, and then look at the bottom line. I thought this would be of particular interest to the Values Committee of CACO. So that's basically why I included it. And I thought that when this comes out in YouTube, that anybody who wants reference to this can. But well, I was in Jamaica for 2 years on a special assignment to help the reorganization of the Natural Resources Conservation Authority, and give you what's one example of how this came about. Countries like Sweden, and they would come every year and offer guidance. Now they had all of these big canals there that to handle rainflow coming down off the Blue Mountain. And what happened is a lot of the people that were poor and in hovels would dump all the garbage in these canals. And they all ended up in Kingston Harbor in an absolute mess. And so somebody would come in like Sweden and say, okay, we'll clean up those gullies. So they pull it out. And I said to their board of directors, I said, this is wrong. This is wrong. The garbage is only the ultimate symptom. The problem is, what is it? Is it you don't have enough garbage trucks? Is it people don't understand the consequences of action? Get to the mega root cause and start to go from the root cause up and work backwards. And so that's why I find this kind of a display quite helpful. Okay, UNCED preparations, okay? As I said, it was 2 years duration. I was co-head of the Canadian delegation along with Ambassador John Bell, and we were preparing an agenda for the 21st century. And then John was the global affairs. Okay, there were 5 to 6 week prep cons, and all of those were 5 to 6 weeks long each. But the first one was an organization meeting. And it took time, it was over a 2-year period. And as you can imagine, we had, as you'll see in a minute, how big Agenda 21 turned out to be, 39 chapters, 700 pages. And that's after cutting away a lot of text. So every week or every day, there were different experts flying in with us, and I was the guy that was common in the seat the whole time. Okay? And the idea was to create this so it could be agreed upon by heads of government, and they came to Rio in June 1992. But the important thing is that in the run-up to that, there was a very interesting debate, and it was an intellectual debate and fundamentally an ethical debate. And it emerged over what was then called the web, now the internet, amongst participants and even NGOs at the margins of the meetings. When it came time to convert the composite final negotiating text to decision, I correct myself, 118 heads of government, hogs I called them, showed up, tended to finalize and agree on Agenda 21 and sign off on the Rio Declaration, which is another really fallacious fault because we really wanted Euro's charter there, but I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, and several other conventions I already described, so I won't go through those again. The sustainable development discussions were popularized at the time of global government, and I already mentioned that in this previous note. There were 2 major viewpoints at that time. The expansionist or technological view, which was we have to rely on technology to address pollution and resource loss. In the steady state or ecological viewpoint, Earth has finite resources and ever-expanding production and consumption will exterminate natural systems. The ecological viewpoint held that ecology and economy are inextricably linked. Herman Daly was, he worked for the World Bank, but he was one of the first ones that I came out with a basic analysis on basically the 3 conditions to be met to achieve planetary sustainability. One was the rate of renewal and natural resource harvesting must not exceed the rate at which these resources are generated. The second one was the rate of non-renewable resource extraction must not exceed the rate at which resource substitutes are developed. And thirdly, and most importantly, the rate of pollution and waste generation must not exceed the rates at which they can be assimilated into the environment. Okay, here's some other observations on environment and sustainability. Sustainable development implies and requires resource management of production, consumption patterns, and environmental protection must have a very special place in the struggle for sustainable development. Like democracy, environmental protection must be accepted as being essential to everything else, not just one good cause among many. Environmental protection must have a special focus in the struggle for sustainable development. Sustainable development implies and requires a fundamental shift in resource management and consumption patterns. Canada was a key promoter of a new paradigm of relations with developing countries, one characterized by equality, dialogue, trust, partnership, and acknowledging mutual need. And this was we were leadership on the Earth Charter that got watered down to become the Rio Declaration. I'll hit that later. But also, we were great, strong proponents of creating the multilateral fund in connection with the ozone layer protection, the Montreal Protocol. And the reason was, what's the point of 33 developed countries agreeing to something and leaving 160 or so, or 165 developing countries off of that? They needed help. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the money, so we created a multi-billion-dollar fund to help keep them on side, and that's why it's the most successful treaty in history. Okay, so sustainable development are buzzwords that conceal the cry for an altered mindset. And these are observations and notes I made during this preparatory phase that other people have made for the most part. The response mechanism to secure our future is sustainable development, but governments alone cannot bring about sustainable development. Industry and their ethical behavior has a very major role to play. We can't let the profit motive contaminate our pursuit of environmentally appropriate sustainable development. If we wish to make incremental progress with our environmental issues, we have to design programs which both relate and respond also to political, geopolitical, current economics, and societal related impacts. Sustainable development is a cry for an introspective look at what really is important and what truly matters. It is a call to arms to all sectors of society, especially industry. Those responsible for decision making can no longer isolate themselves from the consequences of decisions from a consideration of world at large, both present and future. Okay, you can't fit environment into an economic model and assume that sustainable development is at hand. Environmental protection can no longer be seen as a profit drawdown in the rate of return of investment equation, because there can be no sustainable industry without a long-term healthy environment. We have to learn, and this we still have to learn, how to best determine the extent to which we're living off the Earth's interest and drawing down its capital. And there's got to be a full accounting of environmental costs, which there never has been. We have to learn how to better communicate the indisputable scientific evidence and how to communicate, coordinate, and empower the poor, both at home and abroad, to participate meaningfully in sustainable development. And I talk about this because the panel on climate change, I thought, really started off bad by always talking about the increase in global temperatures and whatnot, without really emphasizing the consequences of the expansion of the ocean, all of these other factors that people can relate to. It's only when they started to talk about, the scientists started to talk about these consequences that people began to get serious about climate change. Okay, lessons to be learned. We have to learn how best to incorporate societal issues into decision frameworks and support leaders who have care and concern for the preservation of the planet above all else. Sustainable development cannot be achieved in the short term, only pursued. Nonetheless, we must cope with the concurrent evolution of expectations, values, and knowledge. We have to better organize government in a manner that integrates the various ministerial responsibility and a planetary well-being construct. There must be a full accounting of environmental damage in economic terms, and we must uphold the polluter pays principle, quote, carbon tax. We must struggle to move beyond an environment and human health focus to one of the consideration of ecological carrying capacity and planetary sustainability. There must be a full accounting of environmental damage in economic terms, and we must hold to the polluter pays principle. The efficacy of UNCED. As I noted before, I think the most substantive output from UNCED was Agenda 21, 39 chapters, 700 pages long. It was known from the onset that this was just the start. Some attached the utmost importance to UNCED, perhaps because it initiated efforts to transcend parochial interest and strove to garner the political will to create a better world for all of its inhabitants. One thing is for certain, the world is both enriched and enlightened as a result of UNCED, but the fight is still continuing, and it's proving to be a very, very steep uphill battle. UNCED's probably most important achievement was that it instilled within the UN hierarchy itself the notion of multi-sectoral partnership of cooperation predicated on mutual aid. UNCED was not without its disappointment, though. I'll give you a few. Nothing was agreed at UNCED that guaranteed change or even the required partnership. There was no agreement to formally integrate the environment in a development agenda. The critical global economic agenda remains arm distance from UNCED process and will require constant political pressure to see change, and that's not happening. Government's obligation to preserve, protect, and enhance the environment are state-specific ongoing responsibility, which means everybody acts independently to the best of their own interest. Unfortunately, environmental protection is still seen in many quarters as a luxury program, only suitable for good economic times. Yeah, I quote Donald Trump. The Earth Charter was watered down to become the Rio Declaration. We're still not moving far enough, fast enough. Okay, message to our political leaders that came out during the UNCED process. And I think I've mentioned these maybe at other presentations. We don't inherit the earth from our parents. We borrow it from our grandchildren. That was the Hopi Aborigines. When making decisions, always consider the impacts out for at least 7 generations. That was the Algonquins. Time has come for all persons in authority to consider their environmentally related decision making first from an environmental perspective, then again after the economic consequences are considered. That was my own observation at the meeting. Today's decision makers are the stewards of our children's and their children's future, and they have no more right to mortgage their future. Now, I brought up this thing because you can see these guys. I think you both know who everybody is here. It's Johnny Denver in the center. It's Olivia Newton-John, and that's me. UNEP, during this process, asked me, they had been recruited to be goodwill ambassadors, and I was to spend the day with them, bring them up to speed on all the issues that were going on and under discussion at UNCED. Unfortunately, 2 months later after this was taken, Olivia Newton-John was diagnosed for the first time with breast cancer. She's in stage 4 now. And about a year and a half, 2 years later, Johnny Denver died in a plane crash. But you look, what's important here is why these people are important, okay? These people are important because they garner respect, they garner media attention, and they really help. When they stand out and stand up for an issue, and they're well-known people, then, you know, it works well. It garners some support. Canada pressed during this process for a concise Earth Charter, embodying principles on which could be ground international pursuit of sustainable development and other ethical and equality issues. Okay. However, this charter was not supported by the G77. That was a group of 77 developing countries, because they said, no, if they're not there yet, they can't do that. They don't want to guarantee to help anybody else. They had to help themselves. Some Arab states were also in disagreement. So the final agreed result of negotiations and compromise at Rio was the Rio Declaration. The draft Earth Charter that Canada played a lead role is, I'm originally going to attach it, but you're not going to see it because at the end of the presentation it cuts off. But it's available online, or you can get it in the same as the Rio Declaration. You can see it if anybody really has the interest in it. That's it about for now, and then that's it. I had the Earth Charter, but I'm not going to go through it. It's too long, but to give you a feel for what it's like right here. All states, you can read it yourself, but it was on the back here. Cultural diversity, participation, indigenous groups. It really was a very comprehensive comprehensive document, and it really spoke to all people on the planet.
Okay,
Okay.
we have two questions, but first I do want to assure everyone that the slides will be available on our website along with the YouTube presentation. I thank you, Vic, for this. You've obviously put forward a fair amount of effort in this over the years and putting this presentation together. It's just excellent. I'd like to turn it over to John Meyer, followed by Ted Manning. John, unmute yourself.
Yeah, very much enjoyed that. My question is, and for years, we were looking at how to integrate the commercial economy with the environment, how to quantify the costs, how to establish a costing system for the environment. And frankly, I don't think that's, it just seems to me it's not possible. And my question reads, I'm not sure how natural processes and losses could be quantified in economic monetary terms. I don't think we should wait until we come up with a means of doing that. I think we need to recognize the difficulty of integrating economic and environmental metrics and simply establish those standards which are required to maintain environmental health and let the market work as best it can within those biophysical constraints. Fortunately, we've got COVID-19 and the pandemic to show that we can actually do that. No one put an economic cost on dealing with COVID-19. Countries, some did it well, some didn't do it too well, and there were all kinds of different approaches, but countries addressed that directly in biophysical means, restriction of travel, all kinds of lockdowns, and they took direct charge of the physical situation. And the market, what happens in the market will happen. So that's my point. Do you think it's possible to actually quantify in economic, monetary GDP terms the environmental losses and what we'll have to do to maintain the environment?
Well, I'll invite other people to speak to this too, but I'm not an economist, and I've been a toxic chemicals expert most of my career, and that's it. So I won't let on like I know that, but I tell you something that emerged from UNCED I didn't have even time to discuss. That was called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And that council is comprised of 200 of the largest international companies. And they are set up, and you can Google that just Google the World Council on Sustainable Development and you'll see. But these are ones that were created to take a look at all kinds of these related issues associated with the economic system, the consequences, but to help move the UNCED agenda forward. Okay, and that council has not been without its frailties. That economic, they deal with economic issues, and the controversy that has emerged is Friends of the Earth, or not Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace has said they're the biggest barrier to climate change that we currently have now. Yet Sierra Club and then the Defense Fund in the US and several other NGOs are working with them to try to help them answer some of their related environmental issues, to put it in real terms in the context of Royal Dutch or DuPont, all of these huge companies. But anybody else who has an answer for, please pop in.
You're not going to say big rush, and that's a big question. and I don't think there's a simple answer to that one. Okay, Ted Manning.
I'm not an economist, thank God. Therefore, I am allowed to see things beyond the bottom line. By the way, Vic, that was a fabulous presentation. It's one of the best ones I've seen, and I hope to share it in Spanish with my buddy here as well, because we're trying to write a book on sustainability for the tourism recreation sector for this hemisphere. Anyway, the fact is that for many years, anyone with a brain has discovered that there are factors other than other than growth or the bottom line that are important. And every discipline has struggled with this. I mean, phrenology had a really rough time trying to explain everything back when it was important. And these days, the economists seem to have the same issue. For a long time, those of us working through various UN agencies and Environment Canada and others have been working on a whole range of indicators that measure what people think are important. And essentially based on the values they have and the values they have for any particular decision process. There are some very good programs out there that do identify a whole range of indicators, and among them are economic indicators. But essentially, you're not going to measure somebody's health only by measuring their foot size. You do need a lot of different metrics focused on the real issues. And so the latest to come out about this was the Club of Rome, where they finally decided that it was really useful to start focusing on well-being rather than growth, and to actually start lobbying for that. And the indicators and other initiatives that actually try to measure a whole range of things of value and to work with them mean that you learn. It's like the weather. You care whether it's hot, you care whether it's wet, you care whether it's windy. All three of those indicators are important to tell you how, quote, good it is. And finally, they have realized that there may be other metrics useful to help them understand good or bad when we're looking at forms of development, impacts on communities, how to save ecosystems. Anyway, you did touch on my principal area of interest, so I hope I haven't said too much, but I think it is important that we make certain that decisions taken, even at the level of Ottawa, besides our government and others, do consider how to measure and value those things that are truly important to the outcomes we seem to want to get.
Just one response, Ted, on that. Again, I would refer to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in relation. I'll just read you a little quote here on their operation. The council works on a variety of issues related to sustainable development. It works to achieve sustainable development goals through the transformation of the economic system. These are circular economy, cities and mobility, climate and energy, food, land and water, people, and redefining values. Each system transformation is set up by a council program with a number of supplementary projects. So that might, if you resource that, that might provide additional information answer to some of these questions.
Well, Vic, they are welcome to weigh in, but the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there's 16 of them, have a wide range of measures, and they can find themselves, these business guys, in the corner of one or two of them, and they're welcome to weigh in with their money if they wish to. But the rest of the world needs all of the 16 goals and all of the different sectors working with them. Yeah. And if they only wish to measure toe size, then they're welcome to do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and our next one is Bill Pugsley. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Art. Thanks very much for the talk. Which reminded me of what the discussions that went on in the early 90s following the conference on the changing atmosphere in '87 about climate change and Rio. And that is the lack of clout, in a way, of the United Nations Environment Program, which came home to me when my then boss, Liz Doddswell, became the executive director of UNEP, and forced a lot of us who had worked with Liz to look more closely at that. And this came about in the mid-90s. But I thought it was interesting that in the run-up to the Conference on the Changing Atmosphere in 1987 in Toronto, I was part of a small group that tried to see what was possible. And one of the things that came up was the need for a law of the air, which would, you might remember at the time, most countries were agreed on the need to reduce emissions, carbon emissions, by 30 or 40% over the next 20 years. And this followed President Carter's um, global trends document, which came out in the late 70s. So there was a mood in the air to do something real about all this. This particular proposal, law of the air, got shot down by the air traffic control group, which saw it as interfering with what they were trying to do. In any case, the main point here is that organizations in the UN, and that key word organization is an upgrade from program, like WHO, and I meant to say in the note WMO, and I suppose the World Trades Organization and other things like that were global international organizations that have rules is the key. And I just wondered if Vic has any thoughts about that, especially with the background with ozone, which was one that worked with rules.
Yeah. Well, the problem I had with the UN system is that historically it's been a series of what I call stovepipes. Climate change group worked totally independent of the ozone group. So basically, chemicals that didn't destroy the ozone layer were considered acceptable as substitutes for CFCs and some of the ozone destroying chemicals. And yet these were global warming contributed chemicals. This is so stupid, you know, but it was outside the regulatory purview of the Montreal Treaty to allow any interference in that. It's just happening now that they've changed the rules on this. And, you know, that's true of other agencies, UNITAR, UNDP, and, you know, I worked for 14 years as a consultant to various UN agencies, and I worked in 79 countries. And I'll tell you, it just boggles me, the approach so different on different topics by the different organizations. So they're supposedly trying to achieve the same goals. So I support your concern, Bill.
Okay. John Legg, you're next.
Thanks, Art. And I'd like to pick up on Bill's comments to Vic. And we get quickly into this business of measurement or impossibility of measurement. And once we get into this whole business of summits having to do with the environment, the whole thing becomes rapidly impossible if one measures the negotiations against a normal international agreement. Now, I remember Bill Pugsley's efforts on getting a bylaw in Ottawa having to do with air quality. Now, there is something you can get your hands on and your mind around. But the big problem, it just seems to me, is these mushy negotiations at the global level. And unless we can somehow fix some sort of obligation, which is clear that it has to be followed, or it's a disaster. And Vic, your comments on how to get away from the mushiness of these global meetings down to something more concrete, where people actually do feel that there is an obligation to live up to all these big words. Can you make some sort of comments there? Because I find this very, very discouraging.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't call them mushy meetings. The problem is the UN system operates by consensus. And for the most part, never been a vote on any of these things. So you ended up with something that's a lowest common denominator approach. And the idea is you've got to be voracious and vociferous to convince people this is the way to go. You know, and I'll use again an example of Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol, we knew we had to cease emitting ozone destroying chemicals. No question about it. We had many substitutes. The best we could get was 50%. Somebody said, wow, 50% reduction, that doesn't do anything. And I said to, this is a reporter, by the way, I said, you got to get them up on the rack before you can begin tightening the screws. You got to start somewhere. And then you work on, and so how that worked next is we had to set up a series of panels to chart the pathway forward. You know, okay, if we're going to make headway and tighten up controls, we have to show that it's technically feasible to do so. So, you know, you've got a panel on effects, you've got a panel on this, you've got a panel on that. And I don't see it as mushy. I just see it as very, very difficult to come up with a consensus. Nowhere is that more evident than in the Security Council of the UN.
Okay, next, Ted Manning, comment?
I was just bouncing off that last thing. Why would China and US and Russia and the other big guys work together or with anyone else, given the current state of affairs? What could possibly convince them to try and resolve shared problems?
Mm-hmm.
Don't all answer it at once.
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me of the law of the sea negotiation, where I can't remember the fellow's name, but he said the problem with the sea is it's the property all, responsibility of none.
That's the tragedy of the conference here a few years ago, and you're probably right on shot.
Okay, do we have any more questions or comments?
Okay, I was just going to say that the ability of countries to work together, I think, depends on how clear their domestic national goals are. China has quite well-defined national goals, and one of them involves a very high degree of sustainability, and they have a coherent strategy to achieve that. The US and Russia don't, and I would suspect that China could work with virtually any country that was speaking on the same terms. And let me go back to COVID again. It was an immediate problem that everybody recognized, and I think people cooperated on that problem. We just aren't doing it to the same degree on less immediate problems, even if they're much larger problems like climate. So I think it's the clarity of the domestic policy, the domestic policies, and if they're clear, then they can work together. But if they're just thrown together, as they are in Canada, US, probably Russia, it's very difficult to do. That's my comment.
Vic, any response?
No, not really, because when anybody else wants to respond, they can. But somebody raised a question a bit about education. Was it really part of the
Yeah, that was me, Vic.
okay.
Because I'll refer to your very helpful flow chart, which starts with objectives and ends up in with root causes. Now, the messy sort of multi-question regarding how we're educated, how our political processes work, our patterns of social communications. Was that addressed, or it's just impossible to encompass in that sort of framework, so it is ignored?
No, it wasn't ignored, but you know, the fact of the matter is education was addressed, but not in the context of an international obligation. What it said was that some of the various agencies would publish materials that countries could make available at their discretion for public education purposes.
Okay.
And so the Montreal Protocol did that. Not every country took advantage of it and wanted to display it. Some countries did, even added it to curriculum. But that's a local and national decision. That's not an international obligation. You can't create an international obligation to do that.
Well, That's, thank you.
Okay, we have a comment from Ruben Nelson and Peter Menke next.
Thanks, Vic. I'm looking forward to access to your slides so I can work through them more carefully. I want to comment on the quote from Einstein on your first slide, and that model that you showed us with misapprehensions and values at the meta level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you know that I've come to the conclusion that what we're trying to do through this whole process, and that is glue a substantial social ethic onto our modern techno-industrial culture. I mean, we tend to talk about economics and the environment because those are the kind of highest mountains that we see. But we forget that the whole mountain range is, in fact, a modern techno-industrial culture we've been working on for hundreds of years, and we're bloody good at it. The trouble is, in terms of your slide with the model, you don't have to be a reflexive person or a reflective organization in order to succeed in the modern world, which is to say, you've identified a meta level as the deepest source of our problem, but in a culture that has no organized formal capacity to undertake meta-reflexive thinking and imagination. And therefore, the project is doomed to fail.
Mm-hmm.
That you have to step outside modernity to get good at meta-reflection. You either go to pre-modern cultures that had some capacity for meta-reflection, or you go to a postmodern, some of the postmodern thinkers who drove us to meta-reflection. I think particularly of Wittgenstein, after he changed his mind about what philosophy was. And I understand the frustrations we've got. What continues to astound me is that as a culture, we seem to be utterly incapable of actually entertaining as a serious thought that in order to take Einstein's quote seriously, we actually ourselves, not just as individuals, but have to think seriously about graduating beyond modernity. And it's not on our agenda. We keep trying to do this thing of gluing ethics onto whether it's the environment or it's public policy or it's business or God knows what. And the failure rate hasn't changed at all.
What I'd comment on that is that, you know, the problem there is our own value system, because the difference between a politician and a statesman is the politician's only interested about the framework next 4 years before there's another election. The statesman makes decisions on the basis of the long-term ethical considerations. And how do you regulate ethics? How do you insist on ethics? It becomes public choice as to who you want to select to be your leader. Do you want somebody like Trump that only cares about today and how good the economy is today? Or do you want somebody that's worried about future generations, and bring that into the selection process? And we're failing to do that, in my view.
I understand that failure, but I think what you're missing is the role in that of culture.
Yeah.
That it's absolutely clear that in conversations like this, in small groups, if you talk to people, that they express views and voices and apparent commitments that they themselves do not bring to the ballot box.
Mhm.
It's not a difference between we who are pure citizens and have ethics and those evil politicians and business people don't have them. The fact is, we don't take that same person. When we go to the ballot box, we consistently vote for people who look after our short-term economic interests. That's what modern culture is about. It's a cultural phenomenon. And to think you can escape that without dealing with the culture is, I mean, it's what the women learned. It's what Black Lives Matter have learned. If you don't deal with what what at one level appear to be personal issues, at a systemic cultural level, the fact is nothing happens.
Yeah.
And women learned that it wasn't just the guy they were going with they had a problem with, it was misogynist modern male culture.
Yeah.
All right. Next one, Peter.
Well, hi. Yeah, I think to me, a lot of this keeps coming back to education and how one is brought up. That's in fact what culture is. It's how we are brought into this world and nurtured. And certainly education is something I have thought about for many years, and particularly the goal that I had of trying to break down the barriers between the disciplines, which we talked about here today, is bringing things together. And there are so many ways that I tried to do this, but not very successfully. What I did do was, in fact, I did just mention a course, one of the courses I developed in the early 90s was called Energy, Environment in the Economy, which tried to bring those various viewpoints. I didn't put in ethics, but I put in at least those three. And then, of course, decisions about technologies came into that. Another one was technological development for technologies for sustainable development, and looking at how the goals of sustainable development could be realized if we decided on certain technologies, and what were the characteristics of those technologies. So just going back to education, I think that as an educator, I have to say we have failed in many ways, and I think that's another area that has to be looked at. Thank you.
Any comment, Vic?
No, there's no comment there.
Okay. We have then Susha Mann, John Meyer, and Gabriella. Go ahead, Susha.
So I really like this presentation. It's excellent. And especially when I looked at the ethics part, that's commendable. But what is coming in my mind is when I was looking at that slide is what we have seen recently, even, this week, about people who are, for instance, as an example, person who is our finance minister, he's supposed to know the financial part, the tax part, and he has been failing quite a few times. and our environment minister, the previous environment minister, for the last 6-7 years, I haven't seen Canada actually doing anything tangible, practical, in terms of plastic, in terms of, inside Canada, and except doing twittering and traveling business class all over the place. So I'm a bit concerned that we may think we have ethics. Like I was really inspired by our late Lester B. Pearson, but I feel there is a real lack of ethics in our central feudal government system, like in the Prime Minister's office, or the kind of people he got. What type of ethics are they trying to tell us that they are? I don't know. I'm not, sorry, this is on the fly comments.
Okay. I don't know. Vic, you got any comment?
I'll make a couple of comments on that. I guess, it depends which political regime is in power. Because when back in the days of the Earth Summit Montreal Protocol, I wrote the delegation instructions for the delegation, and external global affairs would have automatically approved them. And then as certain governments appeared, look at, for example, the Harper government. You couldn't even, I used to be on Canada AM all the time talking about destruction of, the ozone layer and the implications of it and what it was going to do. Shit, if I wanted to do that today, even with Trudeau now, because he's right after, I think they'd be afraid that I was going to create political interference in the system. So there's been a reduction in reliance on scientists and scientific information and this sort of stuff. And so I don't think it's an ethical question. I just think that the priority has become more on what are the implications for me in the context of me getting reelected or whatever. And that's what's the real problem here. We lack this not enough statesmen, as I say.
Okay, John Meyer, you're next.
Yeah, just a comment, Vic. I liked your cause and effect chart. I'm president of Canadians for a Sustainable Society, and we're going to be putting together a video on Connect the Dots. So very much up the same alley, and we may actually steal a couple of your ideas. We'll see, but we'll contact you. Just wanted to say that.
Okay, you don't have to thank me, and they're yours for the having. I'm here to give, not to take, and I don't need accolades or thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. And our final question is from, or comment is from Gabriella.
Hi, Vic. Your work and your presentation are commendable. Very, very impressive. I will just follow up on what you just said before about the time when you were able to do so much before. And I find that there is recently, or I should say in the last 15 years, there's been a loss of trust in the public service. And it came together with the issues of security after 9/11 and the implementation of different technology of administrative and so on and so forth. But the trust is gone. I was part of a different UN program when I was working in CCC for about 9-10 years. And 1980s, and even in the 80s, I was able to work with projects with UN, some of the UN agencies that bought actually amazing technologies. Like from Ottawa, they bought solar technologies. That was UNDP. UNIDO was doing a lot to find waste recycling for Eastern Europe. And what happened to all that? It's all gone. Like there was a big surge to try to find all these technologies around the world and buy them for developing countries or, you know, everywhere. That didn't go very far, unfortunately. Some of those technologies, and I'm sure Lalith will tell you, one of that solar technology was here in Ottawa, and I supported it in 1983. And TPK, you probably know them or you heard of them, and it transformed. Anyway, that's all my comment.
Well, that's okay. I'll just make a brief comment on that one. Just that the problem with the UN agencies like the World Bank and others is there's so many desperate countries around the world, 53 countries in Africa alone, you know. The World Bank sent me to Cambodia to help them with PCBs because it's a known carcinogen. And so typically it was a dielectric and transformers. That's how it's used. So I get to Cambodia and I met by the government people and I start looking around and I can't see any evidence of any electrical infrastructure. So my first question was, I don't understand. I'm being here to help you regulate this, but my regulatory is to tell you what the substitutes are, how long it's going to take, who's going to fund it, you know, World Bank and others. And that was to do an assessment on what the World Bank might be able to do to help Cambodia. And you know what the answer I got from government was? Oh, we have multiple uses for it. I said, what? We spray it on the road to keep the dust down. We spray it on pigs to keep the fleas away. We use it as a lubricant in our sewing machines because I thought, oh my God. So I asked him, what is the average lifespan? 47 years old for a male. This is after Paul Park. And that was not too long ago. That was about 10 or 15 years ago. That was it. And this is around the world. This is it. This makes it so hard for UN agencies to meet the need. I was in Bangladesh and I was helping them with environmental issue. And then in the meantime, they'd come to me and say, well, can you stay on? We got trouble with our oceanographic. And I said, oh, no expertise. But guess what? Neither do we. You're better than any we could have. We just stay. They're desperate for help, you know?
Well, the thing is, the UN agencies bought things that were not always appropriate technologies, as we used to call them then, for the particular country.
Yeah, could be.
So-
But then remember, the UN agencies like World Bank are working on recommendations of consultants.
Well, exactly. Like I remember UNICEF had their own catalog.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
they had, and it was the agents that came and marketed their own technology that was being bought, and that was it. They wouldn't go beyond that catalog.
Yeah,
And I think it's the same now.
Now, just remember the definition of a consultant. That's a purveyor of refusable information for a very generous fee.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, one of the issues, it's worth a good discussion another day, is that for many years, aid agencies required procurement from the place providing the money.
Yeah.
And I remember even back in the 70s trying to convince people that we didn't need to build schools with roofs that would withstand snow load, but rather withstand hurricane winds. Totally different construction thing. They discovered that after a few schools blew down in St. Lucia, but there's an awful lot of that going on now. And in fact, it's become probably worse since we virtually dissolved our foreign aid program and just made it a subsidiary of our industrial program. That'd be worth a debate another day.
I just want to make the comment that, of course, technology isn't our path out. Technology is there to support, you know, the very fundamental social programs that are being brought in and the policies that are indeed not fundamentally technical. They are in fact social. And
you know, Art, we essentially took our baghouse technologies, which were among the best in the world, to China and put a few in. And somebody said, oh my God, they're going to just steal them and duplicate them. And we said, yeah, of course, that's why we're doing this. You want to get something there instead of letting them poison themselves and the oceans and everything else. But there are many different sets of values associated with why you actually try to help people.
all right. And with that, I would like to stop the recording.